So I'm going to introduce Caitlin and tell you some things about her, and I'll try not to talk so long as I have already. Somebody already said, what, the awesome Caitlin? Who said something? You said you're here to support the fan, and I am a fan too. All right, ready?
Go.
Go. All right. Oh, I'm pushing this button. That doesn't do it. Sorry, we couldn't get a remote going. All right, so I first met Caitlin, McDonough MacKenzie, full name, can't come with more Macs than that, when she won one of the 2014 Graduate Student Research Awards. And because she was local, she could come to Garden in the Woods, hold her certificate for me so I could have a picture for the website, and she humored me along the way. I don't think I talked to Caitlin again for maybe 3 years or something like that. Caitlin had joined NEBC in 2016, and she was in the audience here in 2017, I think it was. Her actual abstract for this project does not mention Edward Rand. And I didn't know what Edward Rand had done, but like I said, I've been thinking about what can we do for Edward Rand? Can we celebrate him when I get to surpass him? And sure enough, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, it was 2017. She was in this audience, and somehow it came up. She was just about to finish her degree. She mentioned Randers. I don't know. Somehow it came up. And in April of 2017, I invited her to give today's talk. So she could keep the day free. And she was really good. And I didn't even realize how good she was, because when I got back in touch with her a few months ago to get ready for this, she told me she had the semester off because she had a baby. And I said, oh, Caitlin, thank God you didn't have the baby in March and ruin this whole plan that we had. She had Sawyer in 6 months ago, in September, and you'll see later why she's named Sawyer. All right. I'll just let this slide just stay up here for a minute while I just say a little bit more about Caitlin. As I said, she finished her PhD in 2017. I didn't say 19, what did I say? Well, 2017 at Boston University under Richard Primick, and some of you are from the lab. Her undergraduate work was here at Harvard, and it was the Environmental Science and Public Policy program. I don't know if you were out at Harvard Forest much or whatever.
A little bit.
But anyway, she told me tonight at dinner that David Foster was her advisor for her undergraduate senior thesis. And I told her that David Foster was my office mate, one of several office mates at the University of Minnesota when we were graduate students. It becomes a small world, everything gets tied together. I'm briefly just going to say I am impressed looking at her CV. All kinds of interesting grants, all kinds of interesting awards, all kinds of interesting publications and things in the works, all kinds of citizen science related stuff. What was your word again? The fan of? Okay, I'm your fan club. This is an article that Caitlin didn't tell me about it. I was just searching the internet. You can find anything these days, and it's a publication that you can read as well. And it's where I learned about Annie Sawyer Downs. You heard that name Sawyer twice now? It has significance. All right, so as you can see, this is related to her dissertation work, and I'm going to move along sort of as quickly as I can because there's a couple other things I want to tell you about her that are a little bit more unique. Here's her name on the screen. Can anybody tell what this might be going on here? And I guess they were the organizers, right? The river group, huh?
I'm wearing the same shirt.
Oh, when you walked in today, when you walked in today, I did notice that. And I thought, I have seen that shirt before. Hey, look at this. There it is. That's okay, it's your favorite.
It is.
Whoops, sorry, let me go back.
It's
a TED Talk.
Wow.
It's a TED Talk, but organized, a TEDx talk or whatever.
Yeah.
And she submitted a proposal to talk about botanizing with my 19th century that is Ann Sawyer Downs. No, sorry, Ann Sawyer Downs, yes, right. It's only 15 minutes long. Did you do it with any kind of prompting, or it was
I
memorized?
memorized it.
You did an excellent job.
Thank you.
And your shirt still looks great. I told you, I don't know, she just knows how to spread the word and get people excited. This idea of telling stories about plants that you love, actually started a conference with a bunch of people in a room who were just kind of burned out after a day of policy and stuff. And I don't know, you must have just sat there and started telling stories or whatever. Do you do the webpage, or is it somebody else?
I edit some of the stories.
Edit some of the stories.
I'm not the
All right.
webmaster.
But this is one written by her, and there's a whole bunch of others, and it's just cool. It's a way to sort of share plants with people who maybe, you know, wouldn't think about them otherwise. So I will remind you about Plant Love Story. She did mention it in November when it went live,
I
I think.
had some stickers
Yeah,
from
and that was when it
November.
went live or whatever.
That's when we had all of our stickers.
But she forgot to say anything last month so that we could not only go to the Love site, I don't know, you saw hats too, go to the website and get the Valentines.
And there's an artist in the audience tonight who made made two of these
Oh
Valentines.
my gosh. All right, well this one's for Lisa. All right, this one's for Lisa. I don't know if Elizabeth is still here. That one's for Elizabeth. And maybe the others are for any of you as well. But very, very clever and very cool. So I admire the way you connect with people. So you've seen this plaque before. Caitlin has seen it in real life. It was her pictures that I was showing. She's on the island standing next to it. She says you have to kind of look for it to see it. But it is on that trail, the Seaside Trail. And what Caitlin's going to talk about today is the research that she's done there. That's if you read the abstract that I submitted, or that she submitted, that we put online, is what I'm trying to say. This will be the second featured review of all time in Medora. The first one was by Brian Conley and Jesse and Joe Sachs. Okay, so this will be the second one. And she doesn't know this, but the galley proofs came in this week.
Aww.
And you will see them next week. They'll be double spaced still. But no, this is the Word version that I fixed. But Caitlin is the lead author on this Floristic Change in New England and New York Regional Patterns of Plant Species Lost and Decline. So please welcome Caitlin to the stage. Her talk, Floristic and Climate Change on Mount Desert Island, Maine, and from the Champlain Society, which we know is 1880, to the Acadia National Park Centennial, which is 2016, when it was actually a national monument.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. And shall I tell them?
What?
In this picture,
Oh, yeah,
she's wearing the same shirt. She's wearing the same shirt that was in another picture.
I wore that shirt to another.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
You might want to stand over here.
Congratulations.
Here. Oh, well, thank you.
Taking
And we
everything.
need more of you young people to come and hang around.
All right.
So this will just do the nice green
laser, okay.
laser thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, Nancy, and congratulations on your long
fortitude.
tenure. Exactly. And I am just so excited that I found somebody else now who loves Edward Rand as much as I love Edward Rand, because I really love Edward Rand.
And I didn't know I love him until I learned about him.
Exactly, so now everyone's going to love him. So, as Nancy said, Edward Rand was a member of the Champlain Society. And so the Champlain Society was this group of Harvard kids, and they decided in 1880 that they were going to take the Eliot family yacht, and Charles Eliot Sr. was the president of Harvard at the time. He was going to Europe for the summer, so the yacht was available, and Charles and Sam Eliot were Harvard students, and they were going to take the yacht, take their friends, they were going to sail up the coast to Mount Desert Island and do a big natural history study. And one of them would be the geologist, and they would study all of the rocks on the island. And another guy was going to be the ornithologist, and he would study all of the birds on the island. And Edward Rand was going to be the botanist, and he was going to study all of the plants on the island. And they were very, very ambitious. And around this same time, the island, and especially Bar Harbor and Southwest Harbor, were becoming these hot spots for urban elites from Boston and Philadelphia and New York to summer as a verb, and so it was becoming a great place to hang out, meet some gentle ladies. And so the ornithologists and the geologists, they kind of lost their focus, but Edward Rand was very serious about botany, and he decided he really was going to compile that species list, and so he spent basically the next 14 years doing that. And he's actually not in this photo. This is one of my favorite photos, and my husband Mike photoshopped me.
Giggle.
He photoshopped me into it.
Okay,
of course. Me and my collaborators. But I think that this really speaks to Edward Rand's his backstory. Before he came to the New England Botanical Club, he was very much about botany and community and finding a community of people to be out in the woods looking at plants with. And so while he had lots of other natural history-minded friends within the Champlain Society, he also started looking outside of the Champlain Society and bringing in other people who were interested in botany. And so John Redfield, the elderly gentleman with the plant press, he was a colleague of Asa Gray, and he retired and spent his summers up on the island. And Annie Sawyer Downs, who's the very formidable-looking woman with the very fashionable bird hat, she was a school teacher from Andover, Massachusetts, who spent her summers up on the island. And Annie was 22 years older than Edward, and John Redfield was, I think, 44 years older than him, and Edward Rand did not care. He would talk to anybody who did anything with plants. And so he brought these guys in to help him on his journey to compile a complete flora for the entire island. And so they collected lots of plant specimens. The Champlain Society kept daily logbooks where they were writing down what they were doing and writing poems to each other. I'm not surprised that Edward Rand wrote poems when he was a part of the Botanical Club, because he was doing that when he was a Harvard student. And in 1894, Edward Rand and John Redfield published the flora of Mount Desert Island, Maine. And Annie is one of the largest contributors, or the largest contributor who's not Edward or John, to the flora. And so while I was doing my dissertation work up on the island, I was really looking for some historical data. I come from the pre-Mac lab at Boston University. We're really into Thoreau. We want to find out if there's old phenology records, if there's old floristic records. And so I was trying to do this deep dive into figuring out who Edward Rand was working with and if they had any old phenology records. And so I was really chasing down Annie Sawyer Downs for a while, because she wrote really beautifully about the work that she was doing. And so this How I Botanize was a magazine article that she wrote that just really simply describes how she goes out into the woods and what kind of skirt she's wearing and her shoes and her hats that have a nice full brim so she doesn't get a sunburn, and how she's carrying a vasculum and she has a little penknife with her. And she was most famous or most esteemed in Rand's field notes for discovering a white rhodora. And so this beautiful specimen is the white rhodora that she collected, and that's currently here at Harvard. And you can see it became a part of Edward Rand's collection, and then he donated that to NEBC. And so this white rhodora was driving me crazy, because I had spent years in the White Mountains and then on Mount Desert Island around lots of standard purple rhodora, and I had never heard about a white rhodora as a thing at all. And around the same time, I was trying to chase down any kind of notebooks or other writing that Annie Sawyer Downs had done to find out if she had that kind of like mysterious Thoreau record quality. And it was getting very frustrating, because she had, just like Edward Rand, she had no children. Her summer house in Southwest Harbor is still there. I talked to the owners. She didn't hide anything in the attic. There was nothing under the floorboards. But in the spring of 2013, I was hiking between Sargent Mountain, or down the south ridge of Sargent Mountain, which comes up a lot in their Champlain Society logbooks, and I found a white rhodora. And it's gorgeous, but it's super ephemeral, because the next year I went back to that same spot and it was all just purple rhodora. So this is a mystery that I'm continuing to follow on Annie Sawyer Downs' side. But basically, this just speaks to the wealth of floristic data that they had from the 1800s. And so this allowed me to get this great baseline data set on floristic change. So I was very interested in if we could reconstruct the plant diversity of the past and document extinctions and gains at this specific site. And for me, that site was Mount Desert Island. And floristic change is a really interesting way to study what's been going on in an area because it has implications that are really important for resource management, and I was working in Acadia National Park. It can help to document the effects of environmental changes, and we've had a lot of those over the 20th century. It can help us predict responses to climate change and identify vulnerable populations or vulnerable species. And in this case, for our celebration of Edward Rand, it brings in this human story of the botanists who were actually working on those historical floristic or floras. And so Mount Desert Island is not the only place where this happens. In fact, in New England, we have just so many historic data sets that when I was putting together my featured review, we were able to pull together lots of studies where we have data from the late 19th or early 20th century and then resurveys. And I think it's really important to note that in New England, we have a ton of information on what's been happening in Massachusetts over this time period. But northern New England is really left out. And northern New England is where we have places like Green Mountain National Forest, White Mountain National Forest, Acadia National Park, Baxter State Park. These areas that are pretty free from a lot of the development pressures that could be driving floristic change in southern New England. And so it's important to try to put this together. And as we stand here as part of a New England Botanical Club meeting, I feel like Merritt Fernald would be like, where is Maine? Because he was a Mainer. So in terms of bringing back these resurveys, we can see in Rodora, we have places like the Finger Lakes, Worcester, Broadmoor, and Needham. And these resurveys have done a really nice job of documenting floristic change at specific sites. And so when I started working in Acadia National Park as a graduate student, I was hopeful that maybe I could do the same thing. And so the timing of this worked out really nicely because I came to Acadia National Park right as Glenn Middlehauser and his co-authors had published the 2011 Plants of Acadia National Park. And I believe that Lucy took this photo of me in one of her marshes reading that amazing book. And this is a really wonderful resource because they basically did the resurvey for me. I showed up and the resurvey, all of the contemporary data on the flora had been done. And so we were able to really look at floristic change from 1894 to 2010. And one of the really amazing things about Edward Rand's work with the Champlain Society is that he didn't just compile a list of every species on the island, he also recorded how abundant they were. And he was a little bit flowery in his language, so he would say things like, this was common along roadsides, or you could find this in abundance on the peaks. And Glenn Middlehauser and his co-authors were a little bit more scientific, and they would put things into categories of common, occasional, uncommon, or rare. So one of the really fun things I got to do as a graduate student was interpret Rand's words and come up with a logic tree so that I could separate his abundance descriptions into common, occasional, uncommon, and rare, and take a look at how the species had changed. So his historic flora had 730 species. 106 of them are no longer in the flora of MDI, and so that's an extirpation rate of just under 16%, which is, I think, high. It's a national park. It's hard to know what the baseline stochastic change should be, but we're losing things like Canada lily, low spike rush. It's mostly herbaceous species, and it's a lot of species that used to be rare. So almost half of the species that have been locally extirpated were rare during Rand's time. In addition to the species that were lost, over a third of the species have declined in abundance. So this includes species like wild lettuce and painted trillium that are no longer as common as they used to be. In addition to losing a lot of species, we've also gained a lot of non-native species. And so the proportion of the flora that's native has decreased over time, and now almost a fourth of MDI's flora is non-native. And so we have new species coming in, including this vetch and purple loosestrife. And then going back to this idea of 15.8% of the historic flora has been locally extirpated, we're wondering if there might be some kind of habitat category that could explain that. It's been a national park for 100 years, and so they're no longer mowing the meadows, and maybe forests are coming in. And so we divided, or we assigned each species into one of 6 habitat categories. So we had aquatic and wetland plants, plants on the coast, grasslands, mountains, that's my other daughter, roadsides and disturbed areas. This was really fun to hike to get to one of my field sites in 2015, and woods. And we, when we looked at species loss and species decline across these 6 habitat categories, all habitats are losing species at an equal rate or proportional for how many species are in each habitat. So it's not something where you can say the grassland habitats are declining more, or species from grassland habitats are declining more than species from woodland or aquatics. And so when we bring this back out to the regional context, I wanted to understand how this fit into the other floristic change studies from New York and New England. And so we have each of the sites. So here's Mount Desert Island, the percent species loss from under 10% to almost 50% in Needham, or more than 50% in Needham. The light colors, I'm sorry you can't even really see those, are places that in the literature did not identify as conservation areas. The darker ones are areas that are either defined, so Broadmoor is a Mass Audubon sanctuary, so that area was defined as a conservation area, or in the literature they talk about the conservation land. So Concord, 60% of the land area in Concord is under some kind of conservation standing as either a National Historic Site or town forest. And so because that's such a big part of that paper, it gets classified as conservation. It would be great to come up with more nuanced levels of this, but it's hard to do that to compare across these sites, as I will talk about in a little bit more depth in a second. But just the idea that MDI, this northern site, has a lot less development pressure. It's been a part of a national park for 100 years. It kind of falls in this mid-range or lower to mid-range section of percent species loss. And so it's hard to figure out what's driving species loss across these floras. And we looked at the size of the flora in terms of the number of species and in terms of the area, and we looked at that conservation status, and none of these things are statistically giving us a lot of information. But I think when you look at the historic floras, there's such a huge amount of variety in how the historic floras came together that it makes it hard to compare across them. And so we put together this framework for comparing. And when I put this together, it made me almost fall in love with Edward Rand all over again, because it made me realize how wonderful his initial work with the Champlain Society was. And at the time, he was a Harvard undergraduate, a law student, and a lawyer, and he was just putting together this most incredible flora, because he had this intention to document the entire flora. He was out there with that goal in mind from day one. He collected tons of voucher specimens, and they're all here now, so we can go in and verify what he was looking at. We have the field notes from his field work, so we can actually look at his survey effort. We can assess where he went. Those Champlain Society logbooks are amazing resources, and they're all at the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. We have a published flora. There's a bunch of unpublished floras that are in the literature, but this one was published. And not only that, but we have this great contemporary feedback where Rand continued to go back, and he would publish in Rhodora addendums to the flora. And we also have all of the contemporary correspondence that he received from other botanists congratulating him on the work and the accolades that he received. So we know that the 1894 flora was held in high esteem, and so it was a really nice, complete work. And so from this floristic change study, we found that MDI experienced this community-wide species loss that's really similar to regional trends reported across New England and New York. So on average, these sites are losing about 25% of their species. MDI was just under 16%. Non-native species are increasing in somewhere between 1.5% to 19.7% across the region. And the same families over and over again are experiencing these high losses in almost every study: orchids, lilies, and violets. And I think also orchids, lilies, and violets are such beautiful plants that they were very well collected and very well represented in those historic floras. But at the species level, floristic change is really hard to pin down. And as I said, I come from the pre-Mac lab, so obviously I had to work with some Thoreau data. And there are 412 species that occur both in Concord, Massachusetts and on the island. And so we wanted to look at what's happening in species level change. And so in Concord, Massachusetts, there was this guy, Alfred Hosmer, who collected lots of phenology data, or recorded phenology data, and he also recorded how common the wildflowers were at the end of the 19th century. He was a big Thoreauhead. He would get along well with Richard. And so we have this great data set of how abundant all of those species were in Concord, Massachusetts in the 19th century and in the early 21st century. And so we expected that we would be able to track these changes, that things that had declined in abundance in Concord, Massachusetts would also be declining in abundance on Mount Desert Island. And things that had increased in abundance in Concord would also be increasing in abundance on Mount Desert Island. It would make sense. They're not that far away. One is coastal and one is inland, but they have this huge overlap in their floras. But in fact, there's no correlation whatsoever. This is no better than random. And so you can't use data from Concord to predict how any one species would change in abundance over the last 100 years on Mount Desert Island. And so at the species level, this floristic change in Concord is not predictive of floristic change on the island. So this really highlights the importance of local data for species level management decisions in Acadia National Park or in other places across New England. And it also reminds us that today's botanical work is tomorrow's historical flora data. So this has definitely inspired me to be better about my field notes and to be more consistent about my data and publishing open data along with my papers, so that the next time somebody wants to do a floristic change study, they can hopefully look back and be like, oh, Caitlin, she was very much like Edward Rand. Almost as good as Edward Rand at setting the intention. And so I think that's something that we, as the New England Botanical Club, can keep in mind. We have this great example in Edward Rand, our first corresponding secretary, who was not just a wonderful social botanist, but also did really incredible botanical work that can underpin amazing floristic change work like this. So I have a lot of people to thank. My lab, Abe Miller-Rushing at Acadia National Park, who made this possible, Richard Premack. This is Glenn Middlehauser, who's the co-author on the plants of Acadia National Park, who very graciously shared not just that data of the contemporary flora, but also gave me his annotated copy of Rand's original flora with all of the name changes, which just made my life so much easier. And I wouldn't be talking to you right now. I would probably still be trying to track down name changes from the 19th century. And so I also have to thank, again, the New England Botanical Club for giving me that small grant when I was a graduate student that allowed me to do some more field work on this. But thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions.
Maybe a little light when you click on the switch.
There was a very large fire on Mount Desert.
Yes.
You think that's influenced the flora?
We thought that we would see that. So anecdotally, I've heard of one species, mountain laurel, used to be one station in the area that was burned and is now gone from the island. That's the only, and I haven't even been able to actually track down where that comes from. It's kind of just the just so story that people have told me. But we thought that we would see that a little bit, at least in the habitat category. It didn't shake out, and so it's unclear how the fire in the mid-20th century, which burned areas that had been mostly mixed and conifer forests and are now mostly hardwoods and birch forests, how that's actually affected floristic change on a really broad community level. And it may have impacted that mountain laurel, but I haven't been able to track down any really specific data. And unfortunately, as much as we have Edward Rand's Champlain Society logbooks of where he was doing his botanizing, we don't have, besides his flowery descriptions of the abundance, we don't know exactly where every species that he saw was. And he was a wonderful botanist, but he was not great at describing his specimens, and oftentimes things like Sargent Mountain will just be Sargent Mountain, and it's unclear if he was on top of the mountain or somewhere in the woods. And so it's made my life a little bit difficult as I'm trying to do a tree line study because I don't know what things came from above tree line or below tree line in the herbarium specimens. So I don't have a good answer for that question. Yeah.
This is awesome, thank you. Why do you think violets are declining? It's some kind of, I mean, I would guess that orchids and lilies would have poaching issues, but why would the violets be this?
So one thing that I think is happening with orchids, lilies, and violets is that they're really well represented in historic floras so that we're noticing their loss more easily than we're noticing the losses of other things. One thing that shook out with the Acadia flora is that rushes and club mosses are also, those plant families are losing species at a high rate. And I wasn't able to find the same patterns in floristic change studies from across the region. Many floristic change studies, like Concord, for example, just completely ignores everything that's not a wildflower. And so it depends on who the botanists were in those original floras. And then I think with violets, yeah, I don't know. I can't think of something that's like really unique to the violet family, but I'm also not a taxonomist or a violet specialist. So if somebody wants to get into the violaceae.
Ants.
Yeah.
Ants.
So you think it's dispersal? Oh,
Could be.
yeah.
Do you have deer on Mount Desert?
We do.
Because we had a lecture a few months ago by a state botanist, he's here tonight, and he pointed out that was a huge. Are you back there?
Over here. Me or Brian? Go ahead.
You got
Was it you who gave the lecture?
Yes,
Yes.
I remember.
Pointing out that we have a huge increase in deer population, and my experience is I work in Middlesex Fells. I come across lilies that have just been chewed off. You can see the deer chew, 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 because they love those big juicy stems.
Yeah, and I think that with, or at least what I've been able to track down on MDI from talking to the wildlife people, is that there's not a clear record of deer populations actually changing very much on the island. And this might be a case where getting more of those northern sites where we have less development pressure and less of the like really dramatic reforesting would give us a better perspective on how much impact deer can have across the region. And again, that's another one where I think Acadia is just like such a wonderfully well-studied location that I believe the wildlife biologists when they tell me that the deer have fluctuated over time, but they're not like, it's not a huge population change from the 19th century.
What about Ophioblastaceae or Saxifragiaceae or those families?
So when the featured review comes out, there is a table that lists the rate of species loss and species decline across all the species on the, or all the families on the on MDI, and I'm trying to remember if either one of those showed up as like one of the top most vulnerable, and I don't think they did. Yeah.
You said you're following up on the white rhododendron.
I'm trying.
Any thoughts on that? The ephemeral nature?
Yeah,
Periodic hybridization or something?
I don't know, and I've been like monitoring that same patch for now. I guess I wasn't there last summer, but since 2011, and it's only that one summer in 2013, which was not unusual in any other way. And it's a long-lived perennial, and I should have tagged the individual plant, but I didn't. I just know which patch it was in, and they've all been purple since then. But I would welcome any hypotheses or study design ideas. Yeah, Richard.
So, Caitlin, you very modestly mentioned the recent article that you had came out, which is going to be featured in the Globe.
Oh, yes.
On Sunday. You want to just tell people a little bit about the most recent research you've been doing?
Yes. So I talked a little bit here about how since I was in the pre-Mac lab, I had to look at Concord data. But I was actually the first graduate student in about a decade to graduate from the pre-Mac lab without any dissertation chapters related to Thoreau's data, because that was all Alfred Hosmer. And so as I was leaving, Richard and I collaborated on a project to look at the rate of phenological sensitivity to warming temperatures in canopy trees versus understory wildflowers. So we expected that the understory wildflowers would be afraid of trees, that they would want to be leafing out and flowering during that really high light period before the canopy leaves out to take advantage of that really nice light environment. But it turns out that the tree canopy or the trees leaf out has advanced by about 2 weeks since Thoreau's time, and understory wildflowers have only advanced about a week. And so they're losing that race, and that gap is closing, so they're getting less light than they used to. And that's affecting their energy budget. So they're actually losing energy that they could have had from having that high light environment. And so you should check out the Sunday Globe because they do a nice write-up of the work. But we were able to partner with a group in Pittsburgh that had just done this really amazing carbon uptake study to actually model what does it mean to get a week less of light if you're an understory wildflower species. And that came out in Ecology Letters last month in February. It was a lot of fun to work on the Concord data set. Anything else?
Did you look at plant traits at all, like annual versus perennial?
We did, yeah.
Deciduous versus coniferous, stature, seed set?
Really, so we looked at their habit, and then we looked at, trying to think of what else we looked at in that. So we basically found that herbaceous species are more likely to disappear or decline from the island. Trees aren't moving. Woody shrubs are moving a little bit less. But we didn't look at seed or any dispersal traits. And we didn't really have any insight into why, besides that rare species were the most likely to disappear, we didn't have any special insight into why those herbaceous species were more ephemeral, or their populations are more ephemeral. And we also didn't find any difference between annuals and perennials. That was the other one we looked at. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Did you try any of neutral theory to try to model what a random rate of disappearance might be?
No, we were kind of hoping that we would get a better idea from looking at that regional literature review, and then ended up on that side path to come up with the framework for how to actually compare historic floras. And so, yeah, I don't have a good idea of what that baseline species loss and species decline rate should look like without things like climate change, deer browse, development pressure.
I think we're running out of time here.
Very
We
late.
ran over quite a bit, but thank you for that.